Our glorious prince has snared the moon, that walks the eternal sky, and makes it his silken canopy. And with this haiku from Kakinomoto Hitomaro, I apologize for the slow pronunciation of that. It is not a book I have read. I welcome you to this third episode of my podcast, Author Talks. The piece you heard just then is an extract from the Penguin Book of Japanese Verse, according to the front cover, translated with an introduction by Geoffrey Bowner and Anthony Thwaite. And it was published, when was it published? First published 1964, and this edition is probably from 1970, considering that the reprints stop at 1970. So quite old, and maybe not with the amount of nuance we might see in some modern translations, but hey, it's there. For the first half of this episode, I would like to give a bit of a shout out to someone who has been doing a bit of work in the publishing field after being an author for some while. That person is science fiction novelist J. Diane Jotson. I hope I pronounced her name right. One of her more notable recent works was the Equestrian Saga, which is I forget how many parts, science fiction series, and The Shadow Galaxy, a collection of short stories and poetry. And recently, together with her husband, author Gareth Powell, she has started up a publishing venture. Not many details yet, but the main thing is she's pushing back against the recent influx and deluge of AI-generated art, short stories, just that kind of thing, which, as I said in a previous episode, is a real problem and needs to be addressed in law so that it doesn't become an unbeatable problem. She is also, she's going great guns. I mean, it's sounding like she's doing great stuff. I remember actually meeting her at the Bristol Con in 2019, I think. Yes, I think it was 2019, or maybe 2021. I seriously forget, but I met her, and she's a nice lady. She really is nice. And her husband's a nice guy too. I actually remember I ran into them at the same event. They were selling, I think it was Gareth who was selling books of a debut, and also Graham Austin King was doing a debut, and that's where I got Law of Prometheus. Anyway, just a note, please don't inundate her with submissions. As far as I know, that's the thing that they're not doing at the moment. They're still getting up off the ground. And also it sounds like she's really going through into a new phase of stuff, and I do apologize if I get a little bit rambly during this podcast. It's very, very hot, like 30 degrees outside, and I would have the fan running, but it's very noisy, and I'd rather you, dear listeners, didn't have to listen to a lot of weird in the background all the time. I don't know, maybe you tolerate that, but I prefer to be on the safe side and just not subject you to that. Also, if you hear any other weird noises in the background, I've got a washing machine going, and I need the windows open so that I don't cook in here without the fan going. You know, it's one of these things. You do things that you do, and you anyway, creative shout out and general shout out to J. Diane Dotson. Anyway, Diane. She is hopefully going to be doing great work going forward. So, fingers crossed. For the next part of this episode, I actually want to talk about and promote some discussion and thoughts in any listeners on a very particular thing that I've noticed cropping up in different bits of media. The incorporation of philosophy into storytelling. What do I mean by that? I don't mean like a philosophical novel. That's its own thing, pretty much. If you want an example of a more mainstream, what could be argued as a philosophical novel, then Dorothy L. Sayers' Gaudy Night is probably a decent example of that, because it's a mystery story, and but it's also mostly a character study, and it's also asking what were for the time, and even still today unfortunately, very serious questions about the expectation of women in British society, whether they can balance a work life and a home life, the concept of the domestic sphere, the concept of the academic sphere as potentially a refuge or as a career or as a deep passion. It's very, very interesting stuff. But what I'm talking about when I'm speaking of philosophy in fiction is the incorporation of philosophical ideas and concepts into media. This can take many forms. It can be passing references to this, that and the other, or it can be the foundation of a story. And one of the things that happens a lot is that people tend to stereotype the incorporation of philosophy as something very highbrow, or something that's meant to be treading edge, sort of tiptoeing slowly towards the edges of literary fiction, in quotes. And I'm a bit sceptical of literary fiction, to be honest, because there's a fine line between being literary and being portentous or pretentious. There is that extremely fine line you have to walk, because if you get too wordy and too involved, I think all but the most literary of literary people will probably think this book is taking way too long to get to the point. And of course you shouldn't jump straight to the point, because that stops the reader being able to engage with the conversation on their own level. So, an example from various bits of media. I mean, I know it's been done to death, but Nier Automata. In principle, it is a hack and slash action role-playing video game that released in 2017, so no surprises there. It's a thing, it's a product, at least that's one of the ways it could be described. But it's also a science fiction story that, real sort of spoilers I suppose, is set millennia after humans have gone extinct. But the artificial creations of both humans and an alien species' machine army that comes to worship humans are facing some of the very same philosophical struggles. What it means to be not alive per se, but what makes humans human. And other concepts like, for the previously group-minded machines, capital M at the beginning of that technically, is coping with human emotions, human questions like what is there beyond life, what's the meaning of family. It's actually it uses its side quests to throw interesting sidelights on cultural elements. It hits a bit harder when you know something about Japanese social problems, like the hikikomori, I think is the term, the shut-in problem culture lifestyle, or the current static political situation that the youth of Japan are not happy about, but they can't do much to change, or the concept of being so devoted to something that you almost literally give your life for it and lose purpose without it. I'm sure there are many people outside Japan that can sympathise with that kind of thing, but it's an interesting discussion, and the game doesn't offer any answers per se, but it's very engaging, it's very in the player's hands because it's very interactive. It's a game that I think could not work in any other medium. It couldn't work as a film or television series. The anime adaptation that's sort of in production limbo now thanks to COVID-19 has to do some pretty heavy shifting around to make the story work in a non-interactive form. I don't think books work as well, because that's something that you can't exactly change. I mean, you can go through it again with context, which is what happens when you go through both different phases of the campaign and replay the game from the beginning. But video games are inherently interactive, and that means they can be an interesting means of discussion and philosophy. Of course, if you just want to sort of state something or make a point or show a conflict, then any other medium is fine for that. I mean, take Ghost in the Shell. It's... oh boy. My experience with Ghost in the Shell, the almost notorious now cyberpunk anime. I have not read the manga. I've seen some of Standalone Complex. I got it because it was fun, and I am enjoying it, but slowly. Mostly because there's this one episode with a veteran sort of who acted as a terror agent during a war. It's really, really horribly graphic. I can see why that episode was dropped from certain country syndication, because that really gave me nightmares. But the main thing the thing that a lot of people will remember is the movie, which gets very philosophically heavy. To its detriment, I have to say, because for someone like me who... I have this opinion about intelligence. Discussions about it don't feel very solid and safe. Because the book series that I've written and I'm working through edits on at the moment, the second book, one of the topics that I discuss in it, it features an android as a character, as a separate recognised people in the setting. But I don't talk about them in the sense of, are they sentient, can they be, quotes, human, but more in a sense of personal identity, because they can change their bodies and subsequently their gender, and later on, for reasons, their shape, and they can also exist later on as intelligences without a traditionally humanoid body. So I think that's the really interesting kind of discussion that you can have with that kind of thing. Ghost in the Shell goes a very traditional route of questioning the emergence of intelligence in non-organic life, which, speaking personally, I think that is a possibility within some scope and form. Not with today's technology. Today's intelligence technology is inherently based around replication and pattern recognition and reproduction, not the kind of original thought that humans are capable of, or even the kind of wild combination of ideas. And also, if you want to see what AI art is, or some really ridiculous examples of it, go watch Bernadette Banner's very recent video on looking at AI-generated portraits from different time periods. It's hilarious, especially with how weirdly cursed the different sections of the different bits of portrait are. Philosophy in stories, I think, has a definite merit, but I think when people talk about incorporating philosophy, in big air quotes, probably capitalized as well, they get inherently scared off, because a lot of people, when they start talking about philosophy, talk about it in very long tangents, like sort of whole blocks of text dedicated to something. Like another Sayers book, Documents in the Case, I did a review of it, and one of the points it makes is a sort of religio-philosophical point about the contrast between natural substances and human-made artificial ones being distinguishable on a chemical sort of electron microscope level, which is a cool little plot point and very interesting. But it also, that section of the book just drags on and on. It's one of these sections that makes you think, did this really all have to be said? Of course it did have to be said in a sense, because it's a key part of the plot, and it's Sayers doing something that she also does in the other Whimsy books and in her other work, which is a strong religious grounding to some of her characters and arguments and all that jazz. It's something that is necessary, but if you write it the wrong way, it can come off as laborious, for lack of a better word. Of course, there are stories that work perfectly well without an inherent philosophical theme. I mean, it could come up in passing as a statement, or you could theme the whole book around it. It's that kind of fascinating, I will continue to call it fascinating because I'm very interested by it. Concept. It's the idea that you are a reader who the author and the book is saying is intelligent enough to engage with this kind of conversation. They don't need it explained to you. I really like stories that leave you without an answer on that front. Stories that just drop plot threads, that's just lazy writing. But stories that tread the very interesting line into the literary without going fully into literary and or even into the portentous way of talking about things, people, ideas, concepts, that's something that can make truly great stories. I know this is a rather short section. I meant to talk about this a little longer, but there's a section coming up which took much longer to do than I expected, and I didn't want to make this podcast any longer than it will end up being. Cue transition into a piece I recorded earlier, so sound quality will change. Once again, I present to you a short story. Not one of mine this time, but one from one of the foundational figures of horror, H.P. Lovecraft. And I have had to be very selective about which story I give to you because, as is a well-known fact nowadays, quite a bit of his language is very non-PC by today's standards, and even by the standards of his time. Yikes. So, I hope you will enjoy this story, and if I find any words that I really don't want to say, I will do my best to do a substitute so you can just enjoy the story at its creepy, unsettling best. The Statement of Randolph Carter. I repeat to you, gentlemen, that your inquisition is fruitless. Detain me here forever if you will. Confine or execute me if you must, to have a victim to propagate the illusion you call justice. But I can say no more than I have said already. Everything that I can remember I have told you with perfect candour. Nothing has been distorted or conceded, and if anything remains vague, it is only because of the dark cloud which has come over my mind, that cloud and the nebulous nature of the horrors which brought it upon me. Again I say, I do not know what has become of Harley Warren, though I think, almost hope he is in peaceful oblivion, if there be anywhere so blessed a thing. It is true that I have for 5 years been his closest friend, and a partial sharer of his terrible researches into the unknown. I will not deny, though my memory is uncertain and indistinct, that this witness of yours may have seen us together, as he says, on the Gainesville Pike, walking towards Big Cypress Swamp at 11:30 on that awful night. That we bore electric lanterns, spades, and a curious coil of wire with attached instruments. I will even affirm, for these things all played a part in the single hideous scene which remains burned into my shaken recollection. But of what followed, and of the reason I was found alone and dazed on the edge of the swamp next morning, I must insist that I know nothing save what I have told you over and over again. You say to me that there is nothing in the swamp or near it which could form the setting for that frightful episode. I replied that I knew nothing beyond what I saw. Vision or nightmare, it may have been. Vision or nightmare, I fervently hope it was. Yet it is all that my mind retains of what took place in those shocking hours after we left the sight of men. And why Harley Warren did not return, he or his shade, or some nameless thing I cannot describe, alone can tell. As I have said before, the weird studies of Harley Warren were well known to me, and to some extent shared by me. Of his vast collection of strange, rare books on forbidden subjects, I have read all that are written in the languages of which I am master, but these are few as compared with those in languages I cannot understand. Most, I believe, are in Arabic, and the fiend-inspired book which brought on the end, the book which he carried in his pocket out of the world, was written in characters whose like I never saw elsewhere. Warren would never tell me just what was in that book. As to the nature of our studies, must I say again that I no longer retain full comprehension? It seems to me rather merciful that I do not, for they were terrible studies, which I pursued more through reluctant fascination than through actual inclination. Warren always dominated me, and sometimes I feared him. I remember how I shuddered at his facial expression on the night before the awful happening, when he talked so incessantly about his theory, why certain corpses never decay, but rest firm and fat in their tombs for 1,000 years. But I do not fear him now, for I suspect he has known horrors beyond my ken. Now I fear for him. Once more I say that I have no clear idea of our object on that night. Certainly it had much to do with something in the book which Warren carried with him, that ancient book in undecipherable characters which had come to him from India a month before, but I swear I do not know what it was that we expected to find. Your witness says he saw us at 11:30 on the Gainesville Pike, headed for Big Cypress Swamp. This is probably true, but I have no distinct memory of it. The picture seared into my soul is of one scene only, and the hour must have been long after midnight, for a waning crescent moon was high in the vaporous heavens. The place was an ancient cemetery, so ancient that I trembled at the manifold signs of immemorial years. It was in a deep, damp hollow, overgrown with rank grass, moss, and curious creeping weeds, and filled with a vague stench that my idle fancy associated absurdly with rotting stone. On every hand were the signs of neglect and decrepitude, and I seemed haunted by the notion that Warren and I were the first living creatures to invade a lethal silence of centuries. Over the valley's rim a wan, waning crescent moon peered through the noisome vapours that seemed to emanate from unheard-of catacombs, and by its feeble, wavering beams I could distinguish a repellent array of antique slabs, urns, cenotaphs, and mausoleum facades, all crumbling, moss-grown, and moisture-stained, and partially concealed by the gross luxuriance of the unhealthy vegetation. My first vivid impression of my own presence in this terrible necropolis concerns the act of pausing with Warren before a certain half-obliterated sepulchre, and of throwing down some burdens which we seemed to have been carrying. I now observed that I had with me an electric lantern and 2 spades, whilst my companion was supplied with a similar lantern and a portable telephone outfit. No word was uttered, for the spot and the task seemed known to us, and without delay we seized our spades and commenced to clear away the grass, weeds, and drifted earth from the flat, archaic mortuary. After uncovering the entire surface, which consisted of 3 immense granite slabs, we stepped back some distance to survey the charnel scene, and Warren appeared to make some mental calculations. Then he returned to the sepulchre, and using his spade as a lever, sought to pry up the slab lying nearest to a stony ruin which may have been a monument in its day. He did not succeed, and motioned to me to come to his assistance. Finally our combined strength loosened the stone, which we raised and tipped to one side. The removal of the slab revealed a black aperture, from which rushed an effluence of miasmal gases so nauseous that we started back in horror. After an interval, however, we approached the pit again, and found the exhalations less unbearable. Our lanterns disclosed the top of a flight of stone steps, dripping with some detestable ichor of the inner earth, and bordered by moist walls encrusted with nitre. And now, for the first time, my memory records verbal discourse. Warren was addressing me at length in his mellow tenor voice, a voice singularly unperturbed by our awesome surroundings. "I'm sorry to have to ask you to stay on the surface," he said, "but it would be a crime to let anyone with your frail nerves go down there. You can't imagine, even from what you have read and from what I've told you, the things I shall have to see and do. It's fiendish work, Carter, and I doubt if any man without ironclad sensibilities could ever see it through and come up alive and sane. I don't wish to offend you, and heaven knows I'd be glad enough to have you with me, but the responsibility is in a certain sense mine, and I couldn't drag a bundle of nerves like you down to probable death or madness. I tell you, you can't imagine what the thing is really like, but I promise to keep you informed over the telephone of every move. You see, I've enough wire here to reach the centre of the earth and back." I can still hear, in memory, those coolly spoken words, and I can still remember my remonstrances. I seemed desperately anxious to accompany my friend into those sepulchral depths, yet he proved inflexibly obdurate. At one time he threatened to abandon the expedition if I remained insistent, a threat which proved effective, since he alone held the key to the thing. All this I can still remember, though I no longer know what manner of thing we sought. After he had obtained my reluctant acquiescence to his design, Warren picked up the reel of wire and adjusted the instruments. At his nod I took one of the latter and seated myself upon an aged, discoloured gravestone close by the newly uncovered aperture. Then he shook my hand, shouldered the coil of wire, and disappeared within that indescribable ossuary. For a minute I kept sight of the glow of his lantern, and heard the rustle of the wire as he laid it down after him. But the glow soon disappeared abruptly, as if a turn in the stone staircase had been encountered, and the sound died away almost as quickly. I was alone, yet bound to the unknown depths by those magic strands whose insulated surface lay green beneath the struggling beams of that waning crescent moon. I constantly consulted my watch by the light of my electric lantern, and listened with feverish anxiety at the receiver of the telephone, but for more than a quarter of an hour I heard nothing. Then a faint clicking came from the instrument, and I called down to my friend in a tense voice. Apprehensive as I was nevertheless unprepared for the words that came up from that uncanny vault in accents more alarmed and quivering than I had heard before from Harley Warren. He who had so calmly left me a little while previously now called from below in a shaky whisper more portentous than the loudest shriek. "God, if you could see what I am seeing!" I could not answer. Speechless, I could only wait. Then came the frenzied tones again. "Carter, this is terrible, monstrous, unbelievable!" This time my voice did not fail me, and I poured into the transmitter a flood of excited questions. Terrified, I continued to repeat, "Warren, what is it? What is it?" Once more came the voice of my friend, still hoarse with fear, and now apparently tinged with despair. "I can't tell you, Carter. It's too utterly beyond thought. I dare not tell you. No man could know it and live. Great God, I never dreamed of this." Stillness again, save for my now incoherent torrent of shuddering inquiry. Then the voice of Warren in a pitch of wilder consternation. "Carter, for the love of God, put back the slab and get out of this if you can. Quick! Leave everything else and make for the outside. It's your only chance. Do as I say, and don't ask me to explain." I heard, yet was able only to repeat my frantic questions. Around me were the tombs and the darkness and the shadows. Below me some peril beyond the radius of the human imagination. But my friend was in greater danger than I, and through my fear I felt a vague resentment that he should deem me capable of deserting him under such circumstances. More clicking, and after a pause a piteous cry from Warren. "Beat it! For God's sake, put back the slab and beat it, Carter!" Something in the boyish slang of my evidently stricken companion unleashed my faculties. I formed and shouted a resolution. "Warren, brace up! I'm coming down!" But at this offer the tone of my auditor changed to a scream of utter despair. "Don't! You can't understand! It's too late, and my own fault! Put back the slab and run! There's nothing else you or anyone can do now!" The tone changed again, this time acquiring a softer quality, as if of hopeless resignation, yet it remained tense through anxiety for me. "Quick, before it's too late!" I tried not to heed him, tried to break through the paralysis which held me, and fulfill my vow to rush down to his aid, but his next whisper found me still held inert in the chains of stark horror. "Carter, hurry! It's no use, you must go. Better one than two. The slab—" A pause, more clicking, then the faint voice of Warren. "Nearly over now. Don't make it harder. Cover up those damned steps and run for your life. You're losing time. So long, Carter. Won't see you again." Here Warren's whisper swelled to a cry that gradually rose to a shriek fraught with all the horror of the ages. "Curse these hellish things! Legions! My God, beat it, beat it, beat it!" After that was silence. I know not how many indeterminable eons I sat stupefied, whispering, muttering, calling, screaming into that telephone. Over and over again through those eons I whispered and muttered, called, shouted, and screamed, "Warren! Warren! Answer me! Are you there?" And then there came to me the crowning horror of all, the unbelievable, unthinkable, almost unmentionable thing. I have said that eons seemed to elapse after Warren shrieked forth his last despairing warning, and that only my own cries now broke the hideous silence. But after a while there was a further clicking in the receiver, and I strained my ears to listen. Again I called down, "Warren, are you there?" And in answer heard the thing which has brought this cloud over my mind. Do not try, gentlemen, to account for that thing, that voice, nor can I venture to describe it in detail, since the first words took away my consciousness and created a mental blank which reaches to the time of my awakening in the hospital. Shall I say that the voice was deep, hollow, gelatinous, remote, unearthly, inhuman, disembodied? What shall I say? It was the end of my experience, and this is the end of my story. I heard it, and knew no more. Heard it as I sat petrified in that unknown cemetery in the hollow, amidst the crumbling stones and falling tombs, the rank vegetation and the miasmal vapours. Heard it well up from the innermost depths of that damnable open sepulchre, as I watched amorphous, necrophagous shadows beneath an accursed waning moon. And this is what it said: "You fool, Warren is dead." And I return you to regular service. That last bit was difficult on the throat. I am so glad I was able to do this. The runtime of this short story was about a quarter of an hour, and in my book that I've got with it in it, which is Best Weird Tales of H.P. Lovecraft, mostly pure research, it is 5 pages, about 2.5 leaves. This is it gives Sherlock Holmes a run for its money for wordiness, to be honest, which probably means I will not be reading a Sherlock Holmes story on here anytime soon, unless it's one of the other... I mean, I might read a Conan Doyle, I don't know. But anyway, for those who joined, thank you so much for listening. I'm glad I was able to actually get this humongous task done, and I shall see you all again, or rather, you will hear me all again, hopefully, in a couple of weeks. Thank you very much, and see you soon. Again I say, I do not know what has become of Harley Warren, though I think, I almost hope, he is in peaceful oblivion, if there be anything so oh, bother. Just a reminder, this book is bloody long and very wordy. Oh boy. These 2 clips are just to show you something. That long stretch you just heard, that was the second paragraph of this book. Just the second paragraph. Oh boy, Lovecraft needed an editor. Of his vast... oh, bother. But these... I've done it again. Once more I say, I have no clear idea. Oh, Lovecraft, so much repetition. That's it. That's official. I am never reading another Lovecraft story again. Oh boy. How anyone can think he was a great writer. His ideas were great, but his style was rubbish. This, ladies and gentlemen, has been a select number of clips of the reader of a Lovecraft story legitimately going mad. Sanity shall be restored in the next episode. This is the kind of struggle I have with a short story. How does anybody manage to do whole novels? It must be such a strain on the voice. I can still hear, in memory, those coolly spoken words, and I can still remember my remonstrances. I seemed desperately anxious to accompany my friend into those sepulchral depths, yet he proved inflexibly obdurate. Lovecraft! Words! Do as I say and don't ask me to explain. Don't? I'm gonna have to do that again.